There are places where the truth gathers dust, locked away in forgotten files and silenced whispers. Places where the scales of justice don't just tip, they are actively, deliberately broken. This is one such story, a story not of a single, brutal act, but of a slow, insidious poison injected into the very heart of due process. It's the story of what happens when testimony becomes currency and fear becomes the loudest argument in court. Prepare yourself for the echoing silence. Part 1. The Vanishing Testimony. The Commonwealth versus Sterling and Hayes trial was supposed to be the landmark case that brought accountability to Havenwood. For years, the Sterling conglomerate, a sprawling entity woven into the fabric of Evergreen State's economy, had operated with impunity. Its leaders, Thomas Sterling and Robert Hayes, shielded by layers of shell corporations and political influence. The charges were devastating: massive financial fraud, systematic exploitation of workers, and environmental crimes that had poisoned local waterways for decades. The public demanded justice. The prosecution, led by a team of sharp, dedicated lawyers, built a seemingly unassailable case on the backs of dozens of witnesses, former employees, whistleblowers, environmental experts, victims. Then, one by one, the witnesses began to evaporate. It wasn't sudden, not like a mass disappearance. It was a slow, unnerving erosion. The environmental scientist who had compelling data suddenly developed a severe, debilitating illness and withdrew from testifying. She sent a doctor's note, official and sterile, but the frantic energy she displayed just weeks before, her passion for exposing the ecological damage, made the sudden, convenient timing of her ailment feel deeply wrong. Her colleagues, interviewed discreetly by a concerned junior prosecutor, spoke of her unwavering health, her rigorous fitness routine, and a sudden, uncharacteristic secretiveness in the days leading up to her withdrawal. She just stopped talking about the case, one chemist recalled, shaking his head. Said she wasn't feeling well. Didn't seem like her at all. Another added, almost like someone told her to stop talking. They shrugged, uncomfortable, unable to offer anything concrete, but the doubt lingered like stale air. The former CFO, whose insider testimony was considered damning, unexpectedly moved overseas, unreachable by subpoena, leaving behind only a vague note about personal reasons. He had been meticulously prepared, his deposition chillingly detailed, his resolve appearing absolute. Then silence. His luxurious apartment was suddenly empty, leased to a new tenant seemingly overnight. International legal channels proved frustratingly slow and ultimately fruitless. There was no indication of threats or coercion in the standard sense, just a sudden, clean break, a disappearance from the legal landscape that left a gaping hole in the financial fraud allegations. His former assistant, speaking off the record, simply said he just changed his mind, I guess. Said it wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Didn't sound like the man I knew. A group of key worker witnesses from the contaminated textile plant simply stopped cooperating, their phones disconnected, their homes empty. They weren't reporting threats or coercion directly to the authorities. They were simply gone from the process, their neighbors offering confused, conflicting accounts. One day they were here, the next they were gone, one elderly woman reported, peering through lace curtains. Moved in the middle of the night, looked like. Another spoke of unfamiliar cars parked on the street for days before the families vanished. They left behind jobs, community ties, lives built over years. It defied logic that so many would simply abandon everything simultaneously without duress. Didn't even say goodbye, one neighbor said of the Ramirez family. Just gone. The trial, once a beacon of hope for countless affected citizens, began to flounder. Without the critical eyewitness accounts and expert testimony, the complex financial and environmental evidence became abstract, less impactful. The spreadsheets and scientific reports, powerful when illuminated by human stories, felt dry and theoretical in the sterile courtroom air. The defense lawyers for Sterling and Hayes, smooth and confident, hammered away at the prosecution's weakening structure, painting the remaining witnesses as unreliable or biased. Hearsay, they'd scoff from behind polished mahogany. Speculation, where is the direct evidence? Were the people who supposedly saw this? They challenged, their voices ringing with feigned indignation, a subtle smirk often playing on their lips. The judge, bound by procedure and lacking concrete evidence of foul play, could only preside over the slow dismantling of the case. He looked increasingly weary, his rulings cautious, aware of the eyes of the public, but powerless against the crumbling foundation of the prosecution's case. The official explanation, circulated through news reports and weary press conferences, was complex but ultimately unsatisfying. Witness fatigue, the immense pressure of testifying against powerful figures. The length and complexity of the trial process wearing people down, shifting priorities in witnesses' lives. It sounded plausible enough on the surface, a sad but understandable outcome in a challenging legal battle. The media, initially buzzing with righteous anger, began to lose interest, moving on to the next scandal, the next headline. The public, disheartened and feeling a familiar sense of defeat, began to accept the narrative of an unwinnable fight against corporate titans. But beneath the surface, for those who had been closer to the case, a cold, heavy sense of wrongness settled in. Prosecutors felt it in the sudden, unexplained silence from once eager witnesses, the unanswered calls, the palpable fear in the few conversations they managed. Investigators felt it in the dead ends and locked doors where cooperation had once flowed freely, the lack of a paper trail for the vanishing acts. The affected communities felt it most keenly, the bitter sting of watching justice slip through their fingers, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the voices meant to deliver it had been mysteriously muted. The Sterling and Hayes trial concluded not with a bang, but with a whimper, ending in acquittals and hung juries on the most serious charges. The powerful walked free, and a deep, unsettling question lingered in the air of Havenwood. What truly happened to the witnesses? What force had been powerful enough to silence so many, so completely? Part 2. Whispers in the Courtroom. Eleanor Vance wasn't involved in the Sterling and Hayes prosecution directly. She had been a sharp, tenacious prosecutor in the city's violent crimes unit for 15 years before leaving the district attorney's office a year prior, burned out by the relentless grind and the compromises demanded by the system. Now working as a private investigator, taking on cold cases and civil suits, she still carried the scar of the Sterling and Hayes outcome. It represented everything she had grown to distrust about power and privilege shielding the guilty. The acquittals had felt like a personal affront to the concept of justice itself. Her path crossed the case unexpectedly. She was doing background checks for a civil suit related to a minor property dispute in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Silver Creek, a commuter town bordering Havenwood. One of the parties involved, a man named Gary Finch, seemed vaguely familiar. He was requesting an unusual amount of privacy in the proceedings, citing security concerns. While running his name through standard databases, she stumbled upon an old news report archive. Break time equals 0. 3s/ there, nestled amongst headlines about city council meetings and school events, was a brief mention. Gary Finch had been a low-level maintenance worker at a Sterling facility and had been listed as a potential witness for the prosecution in the environmental part of the trial, slated to testify about improper waste disposal practices had observed near the old textile plant. His name had vanished from witness lists early on. What caught Eleanor's attention wasn't his withdrawal, which was common enough in complex trials. It was the address listed for him now in the property dispute filing. A sprawling, newly purchased house in an affluent neighborhood miles from where he used to live and work. The kind of place where a maintenance worker's salary wouldn't cover the property taxes, let alone the mortgage. The house was meticulously maintained, the lawn manicured, a sleek, expensive-looking boat sat under a custom cover in the driveway. This was not the lifestyle of a former factory employee. A quick, discreet check of public records, running late into the night from her cluttered home office, showed the property purchased outright. No mortgage listed. The closing date? Approximately 6 months after the Sterling and Hayes trial collapsed, right when the acquittals were finalized. It was a tiny detail, a single, unexplained anomaly in a sea of disappointing outcomes. But it was enough. It pricked at the lingering sense of unease Eleanor carried from the trial, a dull ache that had never truly subsided. Gary Finch hadn't just moved on or succumbed to witness fatigue. Something had facilitated that move. Something substantial. Something that left no public debt. Driven by a professional curiosity, she couldn't ignore and a deep-seated need to understand what had gone wrong in that courtroom. Eleanor Vance began to dig. It wasn't a formal investigation. She had no badge, no subpoena power. It was just her, a laptop humming softly in the quiet hours, public databases accessed through a paid service, old news clippings, and a growing conviction that the official story of the vanished witnesses was a lie. She started with Gary Finch, meticulously tracing the property's ownership history, the names involved in the transaction. It led her, as such things often do, to a chain of shell corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada, dissolving like mist shortly after their purpose was served. A classic money laundering tactic designed to obscure the source of funds. The trail went cold quickly, hitting a wall of corporate anonymity. She knew Gary Finch was just a loose thread. The tapestry of silence that had fallen over the Sterling and Hayes trial was far too large, far too perfectly woven, involving too many disparate individuals to be accidental. There was a pattern, a deliberate action behind the vanishing acts. She needed to find the weaver. The whispers from that failed courtroom were starting to speak to her, hinting at a truth deliberately buried, a truth that someone had paid a very high price to keep hidden. Part 3. Following the Ghost Trail. Eleanor's investigation started small, painstakingly piecing together fragments of information. Working mostly at night from her small office, the city lights distant through the window. Gary Finch proved difficult to approach directly. He was wary, guarded, his eyes darting nervously when she managed to catch him outside his new home. When she mentioned the Sterling trial, his face went pale, and he quickly retreated inside, locking the door. The look of fear on his face was confirmation enough. He wasn't just enjoying new wealth. He was hiding something or someone terrifying. She turned her attention to other vanished witnesses from the original trial list. Finding them was difficult. Many had seemingly dropped off the grid entirely, their old addresses empty, forwarding addresses leading nowhere, social media profiles deactivated or scrubbed. But by cross-referencing old witness lists from faded news articles and court documents with public records, property deeds, vehicle registrations, and even obituances, she found a few more instances of unexpected life changes coinciding with the trial's collapse. A former secretary who suddenly opened a high-end bakery downtown, a venture far beyond her previous means. A low-level manager whose child suddenly got into an exclusive private school on a full scholarship that wasn't need-based, a scholarship funded by an anonymous donor. Small, disparate pieces that, when viewed together, began to form a disturbing pattern. Quiet, unassuming people connected to the trial suddenly experiencing significant, unexplained financial windfalls or life upgrades. It wasn't random luck. It was targeted, strategic, and paid for. Eleanor tried reaching out to those she could locate. Most hung up or politely but firmly refused to talk about the trial, their voices tight with unspoken anxiety. She managed to speak briefly with a woman named Carol, who had been a potential witness regarding workplace safety violations. Carol's voice trembled when Eleanor introduced herself and the topic. I don't want to talk about that, Carol said quickly. Her words rushed. I understand you might be reluctant, Eleanor said softly. But something doesn't sit right about how that trial ended. People just vanished. Please, Carol pleaded, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Leave it alone. It's over. Just leave it alone. For your own sake. They watch. Who watches? Eleanor pressed gently. A sharp intake of breath on the other end, then silence. The line went dead. A few seemed genuinely scared, their fear a palpable thing transmitted through the phone lines. It wasn't just apathy or disinterest. It was terror, a deep-seated dread that suggested serious consequences for speaking out. She shifted her focus to the defense side of the Sterling and Hayes trial. Who had the motive and the means to orchestrate such widespread witness interference? The legal team was large and expensive, a phalanx of high-powered lawyers from reputable firms. But one name kept surfacing in various capacities, always slightly removed from the main spotlight: Arthur Grimshaw. He wasn't lead counsel, not even senior counsel, didn't make the televised press conferences or deliver soaring arguments in court. He was a mid-level lawyer, known for his discretion and his ability to handle delicate matters outside the courtroom, a kind of legal ghost, rarely seen but constantly active behind the scenes. He specialized, unofficially, in litigation support and witness liaison. Digging into Grimshaw's background revealed little public information. He operated in the shadows, leaving minimal digital footprint, preferring face-to-face meetings and encrypted communications. But speaking to old contacts in the legal community yielded grudging insights. Grimshaw had a reputation, whispered in hushed tones in courthouse hallways and behind closed office doors. Not for legal brilliance, but for getting things done, for solving intractable problems for wealthy clients. Whispers followed him, rumors of aggressive tactics, of making problems disappear, of operating in a moral gray area that most lawyers wouldn't touch. Some said he was the fixer for wealthy clients who preferred to operate outside the traditional legal arena, for whom legal obstacles were merely problems to be bypassed or removed, rather than argued. Eleanor started watching Grimshaw. His office was in a nondescript building downtown, tucked away on a high floor, his name absent from the building directory. He moved with a quiet efficiency, a man who seemed to blend into the background. He met with a variety of people. Some looked like standard clients, suited and briefcase carrying. Others seemed less conventional, their faces hard, their demeanor guarded, meeting in unmarked cars or the back booths of dive bars. Break time equals 0. 7S/. She noticed he often met people in out-of-the-way coffee shops in different neighborhoods, park benches on the outskirts of town, or in the back rooms of quiet restaurants, places where discretion was possible. Transactions seemed to occur discreetly. Envelopes exchanged, briefcases passed under tables, quick handshakes that looked like something more. He was careful, meticulous, a predator operating in plain sight by making himself forgettable. Her investigation became dangerous. It started subtly. Strange noises on her phone line, emails that seemed to be opened before she read them. Then it escalated. A tire slashed in a parking garage, the lug nuts on another tire loosened. Her apartment broken into, nothing stolen, but drawers pulled open, papers disturbed, a clear message that she was being watched, that her privacy was an illusion. An anonymous email with a veiled threat, mentioning her family, her elderly mother living alone across the state. The pressure mounted, the sense of being watched intensified. She felt eyes on her on the street, saw the same dark sedan parked on her block multiple times. She was getting closer. The ghost trail wasn't just financial. It was a trail of fear, coercion, and meticulously executed silence, all leading back to the man in the shadows, Arthur Grimshaw, and the powerful interests he served. Red herrings appeared. Anonymous calls suggesting disgruntled former Sterling employees were behind the witness issues, rumors of a rival company bribing witnesses to sabotage the trial, designed to distract her, to muddy the waters, to make her doubt her own conclusions. But Eleanor's gut, the cold logic of the pattern shed uncovered, and the chilling pattern of silenced voices, kept her focused on the central, horrifying possibility. That the justice system hadn't failed on its own, but had been deliberately, systematically sabotaged by a professional. Part 4. The Turning Point. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A former colleague from the DA's office, Detective Ray Miller, now working cold cases. He remembered Eleanor's intense interest in the Sterling and Hayes aftermath and contacted her about an unsolved disappearance from around the same time. Maria Rodriguez, a single mother who had worked at the Sterling plant and was prominently listed on the initial prosecution witness list, had vanished without a trace from her small apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Havenwood. Her case had been classified as a missing person, possibly having left town voluntarily to escape personal problems, a common assumption in cases with no immediate signs of foul play. Her child had been found days later with a neighbor, confused and scared, with a hastily scribbled note from Maria about needing to leave suddenly. "Hey, Eleanor," Miller's voice crackled slightly over the phone. "Remember that Sterling trial mess? The witnesses who vanished? Hard to forget, Ray," she replied, a familiar tightness in her chest. "It's been bothering me for a year." "Yeah, well, I'm looking at an old missing person file," Miller said. "Maria Rodriguez. Worked at Sterling on the witness list. Went missing right when things started falling apart in court." Eleanor sat straighter in her chair. "Maria Rodriguez. I remember that name. Her file said she left voluntarily, right? Note to the neighbor? That's what Patrol bought," Miller said, his tone skeptical. "But the neighbor said Maria would never leave her kid like that. And the note looked forced. Not her usual handwriting, according to the neighbor. Just had to go take care of one. No explanation, no wolvie." Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Maria Rodriguez was one of the key worker witnesses who had simply stopped cooperating, one of the ones whose disappearance from the process had felt most inexplicable to the original prosecution team. Unlike the others who had simply become unreachable or recanted their testimony, Maria had physically disappeared from her life. "Send me everything you have on Maria's file, Ray," Eleanor said, her voice low and urgent. "Everything." She focused intensely on Maria's case, reviewing the sparse missing person file with Miller later that week over lukewarm coffee in his cluttered office. Patrol didn't have much to go on, Miller said, pushing a thin file across the desk. No signs of forced entry. Neighbors didn't see anything suspicious except maybe some cars they didn't recognize on the street in the days before she was gone. They revisited the scene together, spoke to the same neighbors who remembered Maria and her young son. They described Maria as dedicated, reliable, hardworking, and looking forward to testifying, hoping it would bring change and accountability for the environmental damage that had affected her community. The idea that she would abandon her child was unthinkable to those who knew her, contradicting the narrative in the police file. The hastily scribbled note fell off, not in her usual handwriting and too vague. Working late into the night, sometimes cross-referencing data points with Miller over encrypted messages, other times alone in her office, Eleanor connected Grimshaw's movements, the convoluted financial trail she had uncovered, and the timeline of Maria's disappearance. They found a faint, almost invisible connection. A burner phone, briefly active around the time Maria vanished, purchased with cash from a convenience store miles from her home, pinged cell towers near an address later linked to one of Grimshaw's shell corporations, an industrial storage unit far outside the city, nestled in a remote industrial park near the highway. The phone records, obtained through a complicated legal maneuver involving a different, legitimate, ongoing investigation, were scrubbed, the calls untraceable, but metadata sometimes leaves ghosts, patterns of movement and activation that tell a story even when the content is gone. "It's thin, L," Miller said, looking at the cell tower data printout. "A few pings near a storage facility owned by a company that dissolved a year ago. Could be a coincidence." "Maybe," Eleanor conceded, "but it lines up with Grimshaw's known pattern of using temporary, untraceable assets. And it lines up with Maria's disappearance timeline." Then, a crucial piece fell into place. An anonymous, encrypted message arrived in Eleanor's secure inbox late one night. It was brief, containing coordinates for the storage unit Miller had identified and a date that coincided precisely with Maria Rodriguez's disappearance. The message simply read, "Unit B14. Date of resolution. For Maria." The source was unknown, a digital ghost, but the message felt genuine, desperate, a carefully calculated leak. It pointed unequivocally to the storage unit address Grimshaw's shell corporation had rented. Someone, somewhere, knew something and was trying to help, perhaps a former associate of Grimshaw's with a conscience, or someone else caught in the web of his operations, now wanting out. Eleanor immediately contacted Detective Miller, sharing the anonymous tip. "This is it, Ray," she said, her voice tight with a mix of dread and grim satisfaction. "This is where he was operating, the storage unit, and date of resolution." Miller finished her sentence, his voice grim. The date Maria Rodriguez disappeared. The combined information, though circumstantial, was compelling enough to convince a judge to grant a warrant for the storage unit based on the missing person case. The key was framing it not just as witness tampering, which was hard to prove without the witnesses, but as a potential site related to a high-risk missing person investigation. Maria Rodriguez. What they found inside confirmed Eleanor's darkest fears and far exceeded anything she had anticipated. Not a body, thankfully, but something almost as chilling, a meticulous clinical archive of Grimshaw's operation. Carefully organized files contain surveillance photos of witnesses and their families, financial records detailing large payments to various names, many matching the vanished witnesses or their families, coded correspondence regarding agreements and terms, burner phone logs, and, chillingly, a series of audio recordings, brief, clipped conversations about resolutions and loose ends. And among the files, a chilling ledger detailing the status of each potential witness from the Sterling and Hayes trial. Against Maria Rodriguez's name was a single, terrifying word, written in Grimshaw's precise hand: resolved. The revelation hit with the force of a physical blow, a sickening certainty. Arthur Grimshaw hadn't just bribed and intimidated witnesses. He had orchestrated disappearances, silencing voices not just in court, but potentially forever. Maria Rodriguez hadn't left town voluntarily to escape problems. She had been targeted, intercepted, and removed. This wasn't just about winning a trial. It was about eliminating threats to powerful men permanently. The storage unit was Grimshaw's operational hub, his dark archives, his trophy room of silenced voices and perverted justice. The discovery fundamentally changed everything. The Sterling and Hayes trial hadn't merely collapsed due to unfortunate circumstances. It had been deliberately and ruthlessly dismantled by a man who traded in fear and silence, operating with impunity in the shadows, willing to go to the most extreme lengths to protect his clients. Part 5. The Aftermath and Lingering Shadows. The discovery in the storage unit led to a rapid, if contained, legal storm. Arthur Grimshaw, his carefully constructed world of anonymity crumbling, was apprehended attempting to leave the country on a private jet bound for a non-extradition treaty nation. The evidence found in the unit was overwhelming, detailing his systematic campaign of witness interference, intimidation, and the chilling confirmation of Maria Rodriguez's likely fate, though despite extensive searches based on clues from a ledger, her body was never found. The anonymous source who provided the coordinates remained a mystery, a digital ghost who had struck a single, decisive blow against the conspiracy before fading back into the ether, their motives and identity unknown. Grimshaw, facing a mountain of evidence and pressure from both federal and state authorities, eventually cut a deal. He provided details on some of his methods and lower-level associates, outlining the sophisticated network he used for payments, surveillance, and coercion. However, he adamantly refused to name the ultimate beneficiaries, the powerful figures behind Sterling and Hayes, or the precise details of Maria Rodriguez's disappearance and the fate of other missing witnesses, citing agreements and invoking attorney-client privilege in twisted, self-serving interpretations. In court, standing before the judge, Grimshaw was asked to enter his plea. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Not guilty to the charge of murder, Your Honor. Guilty to the obstruction and tampering counts. He maintained the fiction that Maria Rodriguez's disappearance was merely her choosing to become unreachable, a resolution that didn't involve violence, a lie that the evidence, particularly the resolved note and the timing, screamed against, but one he clung to legally. He was charged with multiple counts of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to obstruct justice, witness tampering, an accessory to murder in the case of Maria Rodriguez, among other related crimes. His trial, unlike the sprawling, interminable Sterling and Hayes proceedings, was swift and decisive. The evidence was undeniable, painting a portrait of a man who had weaponized the legal system for profit and power, dismantling the very foundation of justice. Eleanor and Miller sat in the courtroom, watching the man who had pulled the strings. Grimshaw received a substantial prison term, a quiet, final end to his shadowy career. But his conviction brought little comfort to Eleanor Vance or the communities affected by the original crimes. The Sterling and Hayes verdict stood. There was talk among ambitious politicians and outraged citizens of appealing, of revisiting the case in light of the witness tampering, of trying to hold Sterling and Hayes accountable. But without the silenced voices, without Maria Rodriguez's testimony and the testimony of others who were now too traumatized or too well-bribed to speak, it was an almost insurmountable uphill battle, legally complex and financially prohibitive for the state after the initial trial's cost. Sterling and Hayes remained free, their power undiminished, their hands seemingly clean despite the irrefutable shadow of Grimshaw's actions looming over their acquittals. Break time equals 0. 3S / they issued brief, sterile statements through spokesmen, denying any knowledge of or involvement in Grimshaw's activities, portraying him as a rogue actor operating independently. The consequences of Grimshaw's actions rippled outward, leaving indelible scars. Some witnesses, knowing Grimshaw was behind bars, slowly began to come forward, their fear easing, though the trauma remained etched on their faces and in their voices. Their stories corroborated the coercion, the threats, the calculated isolation they had faced. "He showed me pictures of my kids," one man told Eleanor, his hands shaking. "So they'd be safer if I just forgot everything." Another woman recounted receiving anonymous large cash deposits with notes threatening her elderly parents if she didn't comply. But their delayed testimony lacked the immediate impact and legal weight it would have had during the original trial. Eleanor and Miller spoke about it one evening, sitting in a diner booth, the fluorescent lights harsh above them. "So, we got the guy who did the dirty work," Miller said, stirring his coffee. "But the ones who paid for it walk away clean." Eleanor looked out the window at the passing traffic. "That's the system, isn't it, Ray? The higher you are, the easier it is to pay someone to take the fall or to bury the problem so deep it can never be found." "Maria Rodriguez," Miller said softly. "Do you think we'll ever find her?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I don't know, Ray. Grimshaw won't talk. And the people he worked for made sure there were no loose ends on their side. Some things, they just disappear." Eleanor Vance returned to her private investigation work, but she was fundamentally changed. She had peered into a dark, operational corner of the legal world and seen how easily truth could be manipulated, how vulnerable the pursuit of justice was to corruption when enough money and ruthlessness were applied. The case of Arthur Grimshaw became a chilling cautionary tale whispered in legal circles, a reminder that the battle for truth didn't end in the courtroom, and often, the real villains never face consequences. The deepest wound left by the echoing silence was the unresolved fate of Maria Rodriguez and the chilling implication of Grimshaw's single, cold word in the ledger, resolved. It hinted at a finality, a level of ruthlessness that went far beyond simply silencing testimony. It was a permanent erasure. And in the quiet hours, Eleanor Vance sometimes wondered how many other names in Grimshaw's hidden ledgers had the same terrifying word written next to them, lost forever to the silence he had so carefully, so chillingly engineered. The knowledge that such darkness operated just beneath the surface of ordinary life, that truth could be murdered and buried without a trace, left a permanent, unsettling shadow over the city, a silent scream echoing in the places where witnesses used to stand.